So thank you very much. So today I'm coming here to talk to you about security. So generally, I think there's a lot of things that the information security industry could learn from SRE, and this is my attempt to kind of talk a bit about how we could use your help in things that you could help us with. So just to set the scene, I'm currently the Director of Governance, Risk Management and Compliance for Security and Privacy at LastPass. But I don't have the typical GRC type background. So I started hacking back in 97, 98 when I was 13 years old. I was a penetration tester and product security tester for a number of years. I have more than a decade of engineering experience, largely in the telecommunications space. And I've been mostly focusing on governance, risk and compliance since about 2014. Prior to starting at LastPass, about 2.5, 3 months ago, I was a consultant, and for the last 5 years, I was helping organizations evolve everything from 7 developers up to a couple of dozens or hundreds, and helping them integrate security practices into their development, etc. And I'm largely a safety science and resilience engineering nerd, and I'm sure you will see that throughout the talk, what I have to tell you today. So the reason why I say that is because I'm certain that the moment that I said my job title, this was kind of what you started thinking about. Maybe you haven't told me, but that's usually the type of reaction that I get from engineering community whenever they see people with my job title. So hopefully it's uphill from here. Let's see. So there's a big misconception, or people don't really understand what the GRC things sometimes do, so just to get everyone on a similar page. So the idea behind GRC is that we have this collection of capabilities that allow for informed decision making. Right? There are always a lot of things happening in our organizations at any point in time, and often keeping those networks of those layers synchronized and with the right information at the right time so it can support informed decision making by each stakeholder is complicated. It's hard. Right? So GRC is supposedly a function that is supposed to be tying these things together so that people have the right information at the right time. So there's the element around the alignment of processes in governance, the aspects around risk management, so how we identify and then create the plans on how we're going to treat organizational risks. And there's everything around compliance, which is not just legal and regulatory requirements like GDPR, CCPA from a privacy point of view, but also contractual requirements if you're in the B2B space, and any framework requirements like ISO 27001 certifications, SOC 2 attestations, and all of those other kind of internal and external audit type things that my team is responsible for. The problem is that we're a bit stuck, and we kind of been a bit stuck for many years now. We are stuck between a few different places, and I'm going to try and explain what my thoughts are on that. So what comes next is usually one of the reasons why I make a lot of friends, but in my particular industry, people sometimes don't like the type of things that I say. Yeah, I think that's kind of where we are. So from a G and the C, we're stuck, right? In the places where we're stuck is the first one, we're stuck in a command and control centralized mode of things, right? We write a few policies, a few processes, and we expect that that's how work actually works, right? When everyone in this room, I'm sure you know that between the planning and the doing, there are significant differences. The other problem is that we keep on framing the security problem as one of awareness, right? This month is Cybersecurity Month, so I'm sure you've all been indoctrinated with, in your own companies about what it means to be aware. But the problem with awareness is that it often redirects resources and efforts from actually looking at the goal constraints and trade-offs, which are the result of, which are what usually contributes to insecure behaviors, and instead we're focusing on things like making you watch videos to think that you'll be better aware and as such make less mistakes that could lead to security problems. Another issue is that we are usually detached from the operational realities, right? We exist at the back end. We have our reporting goes to senior management, to execs. We live very, very far away from operations. And that comes with with us not really understanding how things work on the ground, right? All of you who are picking up your phone when you're on call, we don't understand that type of reality. It doesn't fit into what we consider. And this is also exacerbated by the different hierarchical nature of our organizations, right? We know that from Diane Vaughan, etc., the information environments that we create tend to filter information as it goes up the chain. So usually when it gets to the decision maker, it's been washed down to the point of not being very useful, of not being very informative in terms of people assessing themselves or the situation they have in front of them against the goal conflicts that they're trying to manage. And finally, and this is the one where people get really upset when I say this, is that we're actually largely, as an industry, in the business of fabricating business liabilities, because we're putting on paper that our policies, all that thing that maybe wasn't reviewed by any of you, we're setting the governance expectation that that's how we do things, and it usually isn't. Right? So one of the things that I do a lot, I'm based in the UK, even though I'm Portuguese, but I've been in the UK for about 11 years, and I like to see the reports from the data protection authorities, the ICO. So all of them, for the past 10 years, every time there's a data breach, they all have this one sentence: the company was not adhering to their own policies. 100% of them, right? It's endemic, right? We have this problem of not really figuring out how these things happen. And they happen because we have this work as imagined by the gatekeepers, the way we think work actually works, and we've got the work as done by the practitioners. And there's usually a big gap between those two. And we have people writing policies that probably don't really have the expertise to be writing such policies. And make them impractical, right? And that's why we then have these problems of communication between different functions. With regards to risk management, we are kind of stuck in a similar vein, right? We've got this idea that ISO 31000 tells us this is how we manage risks, so we've got to identify the context. There's a bunch of risk analysis type stuff that we get to, and at the end of that, we should have a bunch of risk treatment plans, and there's all the communication, etc. So it looks good, it's linear, it has arrows, so it looks really good on a slide. However, the way we've largely been doing risk management looks a bit more like this, okay? And what this is that we have a bunch of stuff that we call accepted industry best practices, right? We're all learning from the same books, we're all learning from the same teachers. It's the CISPs, it's the CISMs, it's the security certifications that we all go through. So we have a bunch of ideas of what these accepted industry best practices are, and then that generates some bias, right? Some ingrained patterns of what we expect to see, right? We see what we expect to see. And because that is further compounded by a view of work that is work as imagined, that goes into the risk analysis sausage machine, and on the other side, we get a control stop hat. It's a bit like Oprah saying, you get controls, and everyone gets controls, right? And unfortunately, I think this characterizes a lot of what you typically see in most organizations as risk management. So I just made some kind of bold claims about the state of compliance in risk management. Could I get a show of hands if this kind of illustrates your experience of compliance in risk management? Yeah, it's almost everyone in the room. Okay, so at least I'm not crazy, right? That's good to know, good to know. So I think in summary, what GRC is kind of stuck between what ought to be, which in our view of the world is people should be following all of the best practices, because that's why they're called best practices, and then stuck between what actually is, right? And we don't have accepted methods to actually reconcile these two views, right? And this is where I think SRE can help. So at this point, you should be asking, yeah, what does it have to do with SRE? We're getting there, I promise. We're very, very close. So this is my soapbox spiel for this particular thing. I think that the practices and structures that you've put in place, the practices that have been evolving within the SRE community, that allows us to manage operational risk, they can actually be leveraged to manage compliance in ensuring that we meet our security objectives and that we can evidence them as well. So not just meeting them, but being in the position to validate that that's how we operate. But there are some challenges, and this is where I need your help to help do things differently in my industry. Because the first one is we've got a communication problem. Because the language that we use, that GRC functions use, is very control-oriented. It's about, give me the screenshots, give me the evidence, what's the control procedure. There's this whole kind of control language that usually doesn't come very naturally to the engineering types. And then on the other side, we have people that are actually worried about the next 2 sprints because that's what they've committed to. They are worried about their codes, their tools, their practices, how they are making sense of the things that are happening around them. And when you've got these 2 groups of people, and I know because I've been both, and I've struggled with both, is we keep shouting these different words at each other, trying to figure out, maybe we can make sense of this, right, in a way that allows everyone to move forward. And it's not easy, right? It's really not easy. Sorry. And then there's the problem of the artifacts that we're using, right? I think that largely GRC functions are bringing spreadsheets to declarative fights. And we keep on working off of the compliance spreadsheets, asking people to get out of your context and go do something on that security tool over there, because that's what I use for audit, all of that type of stuff that we are forcing all of you to get out of the context in which you do your work for you to help us do ours, right? And again, that's something that really doesn't help with collaboration. So I think that there's a lot of SRE practices that really could help us, right? And that I think you're better positioned to even comment on some of them. The first one being, you've actually engaged with the question of how much. I think security, we still haven't had, I'm going to say the opportunity. I feel like being nice here. We haven't had the opportunity to engage with the question, how much security should we be doing, right? And you've addressed that by thinking in terms of our budget and how you integrate that into a practice that the teams can then understand, what does this mean to me if I want to have a reliable service, right? That's a question I think that largely security industry hasn't engaged with, and you already have a practice that works. You've proved that it works to kind of manage those competing goals. Then you are also much better prepared to understand the constraints and trade-offs, right? Because in GRC, as we live a lot in the world of best practices, constraints and trade-offs is not a problem that you get from reading a best practice, right? It's a problem that you face when you try to apply the best practice, and suddenly in your context, maybe it doesn't make much sense, right? And because we are so detached from that world, SREs are typically better positioned to have that understanding, and also because you can see it across multiple product teams, right? Usually you're in that position where you actually have a vantage point looking at the different things that are being developed, and that's an opinion that we should be hearing more about. The other part is about leveling the playing field, right? Which we still haven't done, and again, you've already fixed that. Which, what I mean by leveling the playing field is that as a consultant, when I go into an organization before I joined my current employer, usually the first few weeks would be me talking to people and trying to understand what their security concerns are. You know what happened was that the bugs they care about and the reliability issues, they were talking to me about them, and I would go on their backlog, and there I saw it. It was something that maybe they couldn't do right now, but it was something on their backlog. When I ask them about their security problems, they all tell me off the top of their head 5 or 10 things straight away, and I typically do not see them on their backlog. Right? And that's what I mean about leveling the playing field. If we could only get, I don't want security to be treated special. I just want the playing field to be leveled, right? That the things that you know you need to fix, that they're on the backlog, and then that allows GRC functions like myself to go talk with senior management and say, look, these are the things on your backlog, you're not doing it, right? But if there's nothing on your backlog, then I can't help you either. Right? So that's usually kind of one thing that SRE functions also do well. And then are the aspects around readiness reviews and standards enforcement. That's, let's be honest, that's compliance. You may call it something else, but that's compliance, right? That's what the work of compliance actually is, right? Toil, we don't even know what that is. We spend most of our lives in GRC in spreadsheets, doing a lot of toil, dealing with a lot of it, but we don't even have the language to discuss it. Again, something that we could learn a lot from SRE. And finally, it's the idea of what we need to do to be able to scale this, right? And codifying things in policies in ways that can be directly used in the processes are a way that you as a community, you figured out is the way to scale and making sure that you keep on being reliable. So it also would require us to look at the compliance objectives in a slightly different way. So something, a book by John Willis and some other authors on automated governance, right, that I would suggest everyone go have a look. But what we can see from here is that actually instead of just waving our hands in the air saying we should be more secure, right? That we actually do the work of understanding what stage of your build are we in, right? So what are the risks that could happen? What are the controls we can put in place? Who are the actors? What are the actions that are being done, right? So this is a conception of how do we think about security in a way that we can integrate into the process as feedback that you can get from CI/CD, whilst at the same time ensuring that not only do teams have a build view of security and compliance when they're building software, but that the compliance team can also have access to artifacts that validate how security requirements are being met by the teams that are doing them, right? So it provides benefits both ways. It's again where I was talking about artifacts, right? If we surround ourselves with spreadsheets and we need everyone to collaborate there, that leads to certain dynamics between teams. If we think in terms of what are the artifacts that I need so that this is embedded alongside how you do unit testing, integration testing, etc., then it's a different level of conversation. So in order to do this, we need to think about what are the feedback loops here, right? So a big problem that we have with GRC is really the observability of the things that we do, right? And when I mean observability, I mean in kind of the original sense that Elliot Jaques used to refer to it, which is how long will your supervisor allow you to produce outputs before they come and check on outcomes? Right? And the reason why that's important is that from an engineering and operations, you get your feedback pretty quickly if you're on call, right? You deal with that constant feedback. In GRC, my ISO certificate is valid for 3 years, right? The things that me and my team that we need to do consider that there's the observability that we have into the compliance process happens at completely different timescales. And I think that's, again, something else that adds to the complexity of communicating effectively, because we don't have usually something here in the middle that can help us kind of bridge the gap between the things that are important at different timescales, right? So being clear about what those could be and negotiating these with your compliance teams could be a way to think about integrating all of this. Because at the end of the day, the way that you experience risk in your work, particularly when you're closer to operations, it's much more like that, right? There's a black line. That's the line of planning, right? When we plan to do to the new product feature, when we plan to respond a certain way to an incident, there's a black line which refers to the way that we actually plan for the work. But how work actually happens, that's the blue line, right? It's never straight into how we plan things. We know we need to work ourselves, and it's going to be different here and there because of the normal variability of the things that we need to do, but that most of the time, it's okay. We don't have problems most of the time. But sometimes that red line, the conditions that are latent in the system, sometimes they couple in ways that make incidents happen, that make security breaches happen. But they are always there. Those conditions, they are ever present. So the work of compliance cannot or should not possibly be eliminate all of the conditions, because that's not going to happen. It's to understanding what types of coupling are problematic. Because we have this view of the blunt end that we work in multi-year cycles, right? That's the kind of the 50,000 feet view of level of the world. And then there's how you actually experience things, where things are quick. They happen quickly, and you need to have a way to bring back that operating point to a place where your system is up, where you can keep on serving your customers. Now, this has implications to how we manage risk. right? And because the way we were seeing before is that risk is this thing that happens in a back office that a senior manager gets asked to approve after a certain amount of time, and that's a very static view. That's not how the world works. So we actually need a different way to think about risk, and something that I think will be very familiar to people in this room is that is this model. So this is Rasmussen's model from 1997 that he was talking about this stuff. So we've got this space that has that's a lot of white space here in the middle, right? So those are the degrees of freedom that you have with your work. That's the blue line that I was showing you on the other thing. It's where we can things can still happen. They don't need to be according to plan. And 9 times out of 10, we're going to be successful. So it's not a problem, right? But what this model is telling us is that actually there are a few things that usually lead to accidents happening, right? That we have a boundary of economic failure, right? Where we're not delivering things on time and on budget and everything that contributes to that. And you all are doing your work to try and manage all of those competing goals and seeing what we do now, what we do next. And there's also an acceptable workload boundary, right? When you need to connect to do stuff in spreadsheets, when you have to go ask the security compliance team to do a manual review and they take 3 weeks, right? Those are all things that add somewhat to your workload. And in this model, what happens is that this is dynamic. The things that are happening, things that are contributing to a workload and to economic failure, they act as gradients that are pushing your operating model towards boundaries of unacceptable performance, which is where incidents happen, where security breaches happen, right? When we don't have methods to try and understand when we are too close to that boundary. Now, the main thing to understand here is that boundary. So there's the boundary where accidents actually happen and where we think they will happen. And they are different, because if we always knew where the boundaries were, we would never have incidents, and we know that's not how we experience the world, right? So, and that's also a problem in security, because our boundaries tend to be not very good. They tend to be so conservative that they end up being discounted by many of the people that we would like them to be paying attention to our policies. They get discounted because they are perceived as impractical by many of you. So if we were to think about how we could apply these ideas to security and to SRE, these are ways that we could think about them. Which everything that we do, as in terms of automated governance that I've showed you, and how you're dealing already with the reliability objectives, everything that you do around release engineering to make sure that you can roll forward, roll back, minimum amount of time, those are all things that are helping you stay away from that economic boundary. From an operating point perspective. Then the things happening down here, they're not necessarily things that would be done by an SRE function, but they would be things that you would need to work with your product security counterparts, if they exist, in terms of being able to provide the capabilities that make security easy to consume and security easy to do, right? And as you work with platform teams, sometimes to optimize aspects of your infrastructure to improve reliability, that's the same type of dynamic that I'm talking about here. Where there are things that we can learn a bit more is here on the left, right? What are the practices? And most of these practices, you will be familiar with them from SRE. They are the things that allow teams to understand when they're getting a bit closer to a potential performance boundary than they would want to, and then they can serve as triggers for us to do the things we need to do to bring the operating point back to something a bit more stable, so less close to a boundary where incidents will happen. So for that, we've got error budgets, observability with the security flavor, chaos engineering with the security flavor, and all aspects of operational learning. So in terms of the risk model itself, that implies that the risk model, how we think about risk in organizations, would need to change. And again, I think the SRE fixed this problem for security, and we haven't been paying attention. Because what we have here is that this is the typical model how risk gets managed in organizations. right? We've got a conception of product risk that is largely driven by a market fit, right? The features that we need, when we need them by, what the competition is doing. And those are usually the things that would go into how a product team thinks about what it is they need to work on next. The problem with this model of managing risk is that basically you've got all of these other functions around the organization competing for your time. And they're just going to you and saying, look, you need to care about this because this is really important to me, right? These are things that you need to do, legal risk, security risk, whatever. The problem is this becomes conversation between senior management, and it becomes really hard for people to feel themselves accountable for something that doesn't happen at their level, right, where the conversations aren't happening. What you've done, I think, maybe without intention, not intentionally or etc., but I think you've solved this problem for security as well, which is because of practices like error budgets, what you've actually done, you've introduced the idea of management of the reliability risk within the idea of product risk. Right? Because now you've got these practices that you do with the teams that go straight into the backlogs, and they become things that are visible, and when things are visible, people can talk about them. And this is something that you probably inadvertently gave us the solution that us in security should be thinking about as well. Because if we start thinking about how engineering risk and product security risk is gathered through practice at this level of product risk, then it allows me, GRC functions, to go have conversations with senior management about how are you managing your product risks. But first, we need a practice so that information becomes visible. And we're missing that largely. Because the way to think about management of risk, it needs to happen with different strategies, right? There's this kind of big strategy, automated governance in heuristics, that is largely a solved problem. It's not well distributed. There are companies that aren't doing this right, but we at least know in the industry the answers for these, right? So how companies like Netflix, like Microsoft, like all of those deal with a lot of the security requirements they have embedded, they kind of reflect that. It's a solved problem in the industry. Where we're not so good is on learning from incidents and operational work, and certainly not on understanding complex systems and complexity, right? How things in the organizations happen in ways that become hard to reason on. There's a lot of contributing factors in how we make sense of the organization itself. So this is, again, where a lot of the talks that we saw over the last few days, applying practices and principles from systems thinking, from safety science, can really help us make sense of all of that. So again, I'm not the first one talking about this. The idea of error budgets used for security, there's a great talk, SRE19, where that was talked about. So I'm not going to expand. And there's also the practices around security chaos engineering on the book by Aaron Reinhardt and Kelly Shortridge. It's the same ideas of chaos engineering. We have an hypothesis, we're going to validate it, but with a security flavor. So we can have, again, team-level practices that make things visible on a backlog so that everyone can then talk about them. And there are the aspects that are also around learning, right? Which in this community, I think everyone would be familiar with the ETSI guide. More recently, Howie from Jelly.io, they're outside, on how to learn from incidents, right? And these are all things that we could also be doing in security, but we don't do them very well, in my opinion. A big challenge that we have in security is that we have this language that is over-militarized, because things, so that usually doesn't help with collaboration, right? If I'm using an adversarial language to discuss security things with a team that I should be collaborating with, and I'm making overuse of military terms, it's probably not going to be a very good collaboration environment, right? And I think the SRE community has done a great job on trying to apply some of these ways on how to ask questions to elicit good feedback, so we don't get people defensive by asking them, why didn't you follow the process, right? All of those questions that immediately shut off any opportunities for learning for everyone in the room. But it's not just about learning from incidents. What we're not doing enough is also learning from normal work. And that's where Todd Conklin's learning teams in the Bob's Guide to Operational Learning book comes really in handy, where we really, by design in terms of how we do it, we separate problem framing from problem solving so that people have time to think about the problems, we have time to think about trade-offs and constraints, we get people from different types of backgrounds in the room that need to have a say about it, or they are impacted by it in some way, and we can actually make a more sustainable way of going about this. So suggestion would always be to start with learning teams in your access control policy, because 9 times out of 10, your access control policy is probably not what you're doing, right? I'm sure you all agree. Because the thing is, in going back to Andrew Clay Schaffer, learning organizations become graduate studies in the skills they require to be successful, right? And this applies to reliability, this applies to security, this applies to anything that is goal conflicts, etc. So, as a matter of wrapping up, so traditional GRC functions, I think, are stuck. We still are largely bringing spreadsheets to declarative fights. We haven't really adapted the way we are codifying. So a Word document on a SharePoint is probably not a document that you're going to read, but then you're expected to know what the contents of those documents were saying. We work as a management by the gatekeepers, as trying to get the certifications and all of that, and work performed by ourselves is different. And there are a lot of tools within the SRE practices that we can leverage to kind of reconcile that difference. SRE metrics are embedding good governance around competing goals between feature work and reliability, etc. Why not do the same for security? Your readiness practices are usually much more integrated into the workflows and can be leveraged also to provide an overview of security and mapping all of that. Why not do the same for security? The SRE community is years ahead in terms of learning from incidents and from any other type of operational work. So why not do the same for security? And finally, your conception and therefore the management, proactive management that you do regarding reliability risk is much more aligned to the dynamic reality of operations, right? So it's a model that is not just based on someone's understanding or misunderstanding of something from the blunt end. It's something that is more dynamic in nature on how you experience the systems that you interact with. Because we still have that big problem in security that we keep on telling people not to click on things on the thing clinking machine, which hasn't been very useful for us in the last few years. Because your conception of work is much more dynamic, your view of risk can also bring that type of insight back into the risk management program. And that is me.